So before I begin, let me ask a question of the crowd. How many of you know what identity security is? Raise your hands. All right, who thinks it's IAM? Okay, you're wrong. And I'll explain why. Today I want to talk about protecting enterprise identities with identity security. My name is Joseph Salazar. According to those letters, I've been in security for a while, about 25, 26 years now. 22 years of that was in the Army. I was a counterintelligence agent when I first enlisted, got my commission, became a military intelligence officer, and then I became a cybersecurity officer, and I actually predate Cyber Command. So I was in cybersecurity before Cyber Command was a thing. I've also had public and private sector experience in incident response, computer forensics, cybersecurity, network defense, both strategic and tactical. So I've been around the block a few times, and now I do marketing. So no more 2 a.m. phone calls. So today we're going to talk about identity security, what it is and what it isn't. You're going to understand why you need it, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how you enhance it. So a few stats before we get into the meat of it. 4.62 million is the average cost of a data breach due to a compromised credential. That is as of the 2023 IBM cost of a data breach report, also known as the Ponemon report. 4.62 million. It's not the highest, but it is not the lowest either. 328 days, however, is the highest, and that is the number of days to identify and contain a breach due to stolen credentials. That is the longest. This is also based on the IBM 2023 cost of data breach report. 49% of 2022 breaches, because this is when this report was created, was 2023. This is the Verizon DIBR. 49% of 2022 breaches involved credentials. That was the #1 entry point. According to the Identity Defined Security Alliance, 90% of organizations experienced an identity-related breach in the past year. That's based off of survey data. 90%. But only 49% of leadership had actually invested in identity security before the breach. So less than half. 68% of organizations had a business impact from that identity-related breach. So attackers are stealing credentials. They cost you a lot of money when they do so. They take you the longest amount of time to detect and respond, and you'll experience a business impact because of that identity-related breach. And then Gartner says misuse of credentials is now a primary method that attackers use to access systems and achieve their goals. This was in 2022. So if you didn't think identity security is important, think again. So why is it so hard to do? Why are attackers succeeding in stealing credentials? Well, first of all is the rapid enterprise identity expansion. Who here is an admin in their network or has administrative rights? How many accounts do you have? Too many. The average Active Directory has between 3 and 5 times as many accounts as they have users, because every system requires an account. It is an object in Active Directory. Every service account, some applications, service principal names, right? The number of identities in your on-premises environment is staggering. And then let's add cloud on top of that. Do you have a federated environment who uses Azure ID, now called Entra ID, right? You have a federated environment where your cloud credentials also work on your on-prem credentials. You are doubly exposed. Cloud environment vulnerabilities. So let's say the past 3 years, how many data breaches, how many cloud data breaches do you remember that were based off of a misconfigured S3 bucket permission? Too many to count, right? There are a lot of cloud environment vulnerabilities. Yes, the cloud provider is responsible for the environment. You are responsible for your instance's security. And a lot of that comes down to identities. Did you know that you can add an external user to your Azure environment accidentally and give them the rights to add applications and other users? Yeah. Attackers using advanced techniques. Who here has heard of a golden ticket or a silver ticket attack? What about Kerber roasting? DC sync, DC shadow? Okay, I used to do pen testing and red teaming. The thing about those attacks is that they're extremely difficult to detect, and they're all identity based. Because of the way they interact with your systems and your domains, EDR may not necessarily detect them. Poor identity security hygiene. Raise your hands if you've done an Active Directory audit in the past year. Two people. How many of you have done an Active Directory audit in the past 5 years? 4. If you have an Active Directory that is older than 5 years, I can guarantee you have exposures and vulnerabilities that I, as a red team or a pen tester, can exploit. Guaranteed. How many of you know for a fact that SMB version 1 and version 2 are disabled in your Active Directory? For a fact that you know this. Because last I checked, both of those are still vulnerable. Who has a print server active on their domain controller? Print nightmare, right? There are a lot of hygiene issues in your production Active Directory that you are not aware of. And for those of you who've done an audit in the past year, how many of you have successfully remediated every finding? I rest my case. So this is a problem, and it's not just on premises, it's also cloud. It's also your Azure Active Directory or Entra ID now, whichever they want to name it this year. So this is not an issue that's going away. Who here runs a PAM solution? Anyone run PAM? Privileged access management, right? You're sure you have all your admin rights, users in there, right, with admin rights? Who has shadow admins? Do you have them in your PAM? I can guarantee you have shadow admins in your environment. Shadow admins are users that do not belong to the admin group, but have been delegated specific admin privileges to do something like unlock an account or reset a password. I can guarantee you have them in your environment for operational reasons. If you don't have a PAM, that means that your admin group is exposed and vulnerable to attack. So what is identity security? There is actually no definition in any cybersecurity lexicon on what what identity security is. So I came up with one. It's a category of security controls focusing on securing identity data, that's credentials and passwords, and the identity infrastructure. Who here runs Active Directory? Okay, so majority of you. That's about right. 90% of the Fortune 1000 run Active Directory. So let's talk about the gap in defenses. So who here said that they knew what identity security was and I said that they were wrong? Who thought it was IAM or PAM or IGA or anything like that? Okay. We hear this a lot. I have an EDR, I have IAM. My credentials are protected. They're not. You have on one hand your endpoints. That's responsible for preventing, detecting, and responding to endpoint-centric attacks. Endpoint-centric attacks, right? That's signature detection, behavioral detection, malware, living off the land binaries and scripts. It's not lol bins anymore, it's lol bass because they added scripts into that. That takes care of endpoint and malware related issues. It does not stop an attacker from running an attack from your endpoint targeting your credentials. You have access management. Ensures the appropriate rights and access is granted to the right people. If access management protected identities, we wouldn't see so many breaches. The fact is that access management protects access. It doesn't actually protect the identities, and I'll get into that a little bit deeper. So you have this giant detection gap, actually protecting the credentials, your identities, both cloud and on-prem, and your identity infrastructure. And that is what identity security is designed to do. It is going specifically to look for identity-centric attacks. What do I mean by an identity-centric attack? If I steal a credential that's stored in your Chrome browser, that's an identity-centric attack. If I enumerate the domain admins in your Active Directory as part of a recon phase, That is an identity-centric attack. You can't stop me from doing that because there's nothing in any EDR that says that a user can't query Active Directory because that's how it's designed to work. So I'm going to talk you through an attack. This is how I, as an attacker, can use Active Directory to spread my ransomware to your entire environment. I'm going to send a malicious attachment or malicious link to somebody in your organization. And how do I know they're in your organization? Social media, LinkedIn, open records checks. Remember I was a counterintelligence for a while? We did what were called local records checks to check local police databases, businesses, right? We would look at registrations, any open record we could access, we would look for information. So I, as an attacker, would do that. And believe me, attackers do this all the time. This is what's called external recon and nothing you can do about it because you as a public entity have information that's out there. And your employees who love to network, they're all over LinkedIn. If I went on LinkedIn right now and queried for a business name, I will see all the employees that have tagged that business as their employer. Or better yet, I'm just going to call them. Hi, this is your tech support. I just sent you an application. This is a patch because we're being actively attacked right now and I need you to run this right away. How many of your users would fall for that? Quite a lot, right? Quite a lot. When I was doing incident response, working as a SOC lead at eBay, I used to say that the user is the weakest link. Remember that show, The Weakest Link? Yeah, the user is always the weakest link. So anything I can do to get my binary on their system, I will do. And when I get that, I will steal account information. And remember, this is an external account. Remember work from home and COVID and all that stuff? Now everybody has remote access. I can use that to access a VPN credential, or remote desktop. Now I'm in. And I'm going to start looking around. I'm going to steal local stored credentials. I'm going to do lateral movement. I'm going to conduct Kerberoasting. I'm going to use things like Mimikatz, or I'm going to brute force, or heck, I'm going to look for an account with replication permissions and run a DC sync attack. For those of you who don't know what a DC sync attack is, it allows me to make changes to your Active Directory. I can pull down hashes, break them offline, do a thing called a golden ticket attack. I'm going to install backdoors everywhere, every system I touch, so you will never find me. I'm an infection that will not go away. And I will move laterally. I will keep escalating privileges, and I'll keep doing this until I get to your Active Directory. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to install a group policy object that installs my ransomware on every system on your account in your Active Directory environment. An identity-based attack just transitioned over into a company-wide enterprise ransomware attack. So I'm going to ask you a question. What happens if I can disrupt the attacker's ability to conduct reconnaissance, exploit identities, and move laterally? What happens if I redirect or misdirect an attack to a non-production asset, a not important asset, or a decoy? The attack gets neutered. The attacker can't go anywhere, the attacker can't do anything, and the payload does nothing. So what identity security isn't. So here's where we get into the identity protection landscape. You have IGA. IGA is not credential protection. That is compliance. That is a compliance function. This is identity lifecycle management. IAM, authentication, authorization, and things like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. This covers access. And you have PAM. PAM is the only thing here that actually protects identities, but it only protects a small subset. Do you know what the statistic is on PAM adoption? About 20%. These all leave critical gaps against credential misuse. I can steal a credential. Even if you have all of this, I can still steal a credential and impersonate a real user. So we have identity security. That composed of two things. Okay, who here is a security professional, like by trade? Okay, there are two things we do. We reduce risk, and we manage residual risk, right? So you do vulnerability assessments, you do vulnerability patching, right? And then you install mitigating controls to detect attacks that you could not resolve. You could not remediate those risks. You help reduce the risk, and then you look for everything else that gets through, right? That's the same thing with identity security. You want to reduce the identity attack surface. That's identity posture management. So you want to look for things like Active Directory database vulnerabilities. Remember when I said about SMB version 1 and version 2 being active? How many knows what admin SD holder is? Admin SD holder is a built-in object within Active Directory that allows me to modify any other built-in object. It is an access control list function. So if I have access to admin SD holder, I can add users to domain admin because that's a built-in group. And you'll help reduce your credential exposures, right? We'll identify things that are like credentials that are stored in your endpoint that aren't supposed to be stored in your endpoint. Admin users aren't supposed to store their credentials on their endpoints, and yet time and time again we find them. And then the other part is detecting and responding to identity-based attacks. Posture management reduces your risk. Identity threat detection response handles your residual risk. It mitigates your residual risk. So this is things like that DC sync attack. This is things like stealing locally stored credentials in your applications and in the registry and your operating system. This is things like running reconnaissance to Active Directory for your domain admins, your domain controllers, and your service principal names. That's what ITDR is designed to do. So the stuff on the right is identity security. How many of you have this right now? Yes. What do you use? That's IGA. That's not identity security. If you're not doing Active Directory remediations for vulnerabilities and you're not detecting or responding to identity-based attacks, you have access management. You don't have identity security. And then we add deception into the mix. Why deception? I'll explain. So, what is identity and access management? This is, in simple terms, as defined by Gartner, giving the right people the right access to the right systems at the right time for the right reasons, while denying bad access and reducing fraudulent activity. It's a lot of rights. But that's really all what IAM is about, is assigning rights. It's not protecting your identities. What about IGA? Lifecycle identity management, entitlement management, access control support, automation, that's workflow orchestration, access certification, that's attestation, meaning that that user is still allowed to access that resource. You got your automated provisioning, and then that's the most important part is analytics and reporting. IGA, like I said, is an audit and compliance function. This is how you can prove to regulators, if you're a bank or healthcare or something like that, a regulated entity, that you're doing what you're supposed to do from an identity perspective so that you can continue to operate. I used to work at a bank. I used to work at several banks, actually, and we had a Federal Reserve audit every year. And one of the things that they would always look at is IGA. And then PAM, we talked about that briefly, which is looking for all your privileged accounts, managing them, vaulting and access controls. You ever deal with a PAM, what happens is you check out an admin account and then you check it back in. When you check it out, it becomes active and valid. It gives you a temporary password. You use that password for a certain amount of time, and then you check it back in, or the time expires, and that account is no longer valid, no longer active, and the password is expired. This is how you protect your admin accounts. And then, of course, you have an audit trail. That's the purpose of PAM. This is the only one, like I said, that actually manages and secures credentials, but it's only a small subset because not everybody is an admin. God, I hope not everybody's an admin, because if they are, you've got a lot worse problems. What about MFA and two-factor authentication? Who uses that? Okay, single greatest defensive mechanism you can use for identity security. Something you know, something you have, something you are, biometrics, somewhere you are, geofencing, or something you do. Typing speed. In fact, Ann Neuberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies in 2021 said that this would reduce cyber attacks by as much as 80 to 90%. Microsoft said 95%. And yet, you know what the MFA adoption is? You know what adoption is for MFA and two-factor authentication? And I'm not talking about SMS to verify because that's weak. Like true MFA, it's 5%. And there are ways to bypass it. I, as a red teamer, did these. Legacy protocols are not supported by MFA. Who still runs POP or SMTP? Are you sure? Those don't use MFA. MFA uses what are called, MFA is responsible and only kicks in during what are called interactive logins, when you've got a user typing into a keyboard. Machine-to-machine authentication is done with tokens. SMTP and POP are old protocols that do not support MFA. So if I can grab a token, I can move around. MFA only protects interactive logins. As I mentioned earlier, you have to be at a keyboard. But here's the really cool part. Once you type in that MFA, you get a token. I can steal that token. I can steal a hash from memory. I can steal stored passwords for non-interactive logins, machine to machine. Kerberos ticket theft. This completely bypasses MFA because Kerberos tickets, Kerberos tickets persist in memory for up to 10 hours by default. And if I can steal a Kerberos ticket, that's what Kerberosing sort of takes advantage of. If I can steal a Kerberos ticket, I can authenticate on any server you've authenticated to. Because the way Kerberos works is a server, a ticket granting ticket authority, provides you a Kerberos ticket using PKI. And you can use that then for passwordless authentication to that service. If I can steal that ticket, or I can generate my own, which is what a golden ticket attacks are, and silver ticket attacks to some extent, I can authenticate to those services. Session hijacking. You've already logged on. You've already bypassed MFA. I'm just going to steal your token. So, identity security. These are the goals. The first is to reduce the attacker's opportunities to succeed. Identities are the single greatest data point that attackers steal. It is the primary target for every attacker is to get a working identity. Because once they have a working identity within your environment, they're impersonating a legitimate user and they have access to everything that user has. Which means that if I escalate privileges and get to a domain admin, I have what's called domain dominance. Find attackers early before they exploit identities. 328 days is the mean time to detect and respond to an identity-based attack. 328 days. Would you rather get them at day 0 or day 1? Identity security can do that. Disrupt advanced attackers for misusing identities. This is things like stopping DC sync attacks, stopping golden ticket attacks, right? Advanced tactics that take advantage of weaknesses within authentication platforms in Active Directory. And then make identity a pillar of your actual security strategy. Because right now, like I said, you don't have it. If you're relying on IGA, IAM, and PAM, you do not have identity security. It's not enough. Because none of those things will prevent me from stealing an identity and reusing it in your environment. According to Gartner, this is the identity security stack. There is a prevention mechanism, which is they call posture management, and there is a detection and response, which is the responsibility of identity threat, ITDR, right? So ITDR is a category that they created back in 2022, specifically because they saw the rise in the number of identity-based attacks, and there were technologies that were starting to come out at that time that addressed those types of attacks specifically. So let's look at prevention controls for identity security. Like everything, you want to prevent an attack as much as possible, right? And for most of you, that means Active Directory. So you want to avoid misconfigurations, right? Yes, IAM has a play in this. You want to make sure that it's the right people with the right access, the right level of access, right? You don't need a user in accounting to have admin privileges to the domain, right? Make sure that your IAM is good. Look for misconfigurations in your Active Directory that allow things to happen that are unexpected, like a user belonging to a group that they don't belong to. Or an access control list. Who knew that every object in Active Directory has an access control list? Yeah, Just about nobody knows that unless you're an AD admin. Every object in Active Directory has an access control list that an attacker can abuse. So if I add myself to the access control list for domain admin, I can now manipulate that entire object. I can give myself read-write permissions to domain admin, remove all your admins, install my own. And that's from an access control list. I don't even have to be a member of the admin group. Vulnerabilities. These are things that shouldn't be there. Like SMB version 1 and version 2 still allowed. Right? Misconfigurations. These are common. If your Active Directory is older than 5 years old, you have these. I can guarantee it. If you have inherited Active Directory infrastructures from mergers and acquisitions from other entities, you have this. Because you don't know what was in their environment before you absorbed it into yours. And then exposures. Your attack surface. Your identity attack surface is every endpoint, every user, and every cloud account. Are you comfortable with having that unprotected? Yeah. So you want to reduce that as much as possible with a lot of things. So we talk about identity attack surface reduction. Find exposed passwords, passwords that are stored on endpoints. Identify credentials, attack paths. A user has a stored credential in Chrome that allows them to access your CRM. That's an attack path. If I steal that credential, I have access to the CRM. And stored credentials have three things. They have a username, a password, and a destination. That's all I need. A username, a password, and a destination. I now have access to your CRM. And I can dump all that data, and I can manipulate it. Find and remediate Active Directory exposures and vulnerabilities. We've already mentioned that. Find and remediate cloud identity exposures and vulnerabilities. For those of you in Azure Active Directory, when was the last time you did an audit of your Azure rights and privileges? Last year? Or do you work for a financial institution or healthcare? Tech company, okay, yeah. See, there's only ever less than about 5% of the audience that has done this. Most people, they set up their Azure and they think, oh, I'm good. Microsoft's got stuff to help protect me. They don't. Not unless you're an E5 subscriber, and even then, it's very limited. Identity threat detection and response. You see that piece I highlighted there? Protect identity systems. This is as defined by Gartner in that paper that I met that in the graphic. Let me go back to that actually. The bottom. If you have not yet read that report and you are a Gartner subscriber, read that report. So identity threat detection and response is best practices, knowledge-based tools and processes to protect identity systems. So it's going to give you detection, investigation, and response. You want to detect attacks, investigate attacks, and respond to them. Just like any other incident response flow. You want to treat identity attacks as incidents that you must deal with right away, because these are higher priority than any other type of attack. Because with an identity, I become undetectable for 328 days on average. So ITDR is detect and respond to identity-based attacks, credential theft and misuse. So yes, you can stop users. You can stop attackers from stealing local credentials. You can stop them from doing AD reconnaissance. And if I don't have credentials and passwords, I can't move laterally. I can't escalate privileges because I can't steal identities. I can't move, I can't do anything. And these will work with SSO and MFA. This is not meant to be a rip and replace. Identity security is something you can add onto your existing controls because it will work with everything in your environment, including your EPP or EDR, or part of your XDR platform. It can work. That's why I'm saying make it a pillar of your security strategy. By any chance, anyone familiar with Zero Trust or implementing it? What's the first pillar of Zero Trust? Identity. Enhancing identity security. So I was a counterintelligence agent for the early part of my career. And so I like to talk about this because this is something that most people don't think about. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, deception is lying to somebody. Military deception because I was in the military, is actions executed to deliberately mislead adversary, military, parliamentary, or violent extremist organizations. Yes, we have an acronym for that too. The decision makers, thereby causing the adversary to take a specific action or inaction that will contribute to the accomplishment of the friendly mission. Meaning, in simple terms, making the attacker, making your enemy, your adversary, do something you want them to do, or don't do something you don't want them to do. So why do I bring that up? Because deception, cyber deception, comes directly from that definition. How many of you are familiar with cyber deception? Cyber deception first started out as honeypots, then extended out to honey tokens and honey nets, and then became full-fledged decoys. Cyber deception. The definition is, and this is according to CSIAC, and I can't remember for life of me what that acronym stood for right now, but it's a government organization. Deliberate and controlled acts to conceal our networks, create uncertainty and confusion against the adversary's efforts to establish situational awareness, gather intelligence and conduct recon, and to influence and misdirect adversary perceptions and decision processes. So why is this important? Because deception is a counterintelligence function. Counterintelligence, organized activity of an intelligence service designed to block an enemy's sources of information, deceive the enemy, prevent sabotage, and gather political or military information. The highlighted section, isn't that what cyber deception is designed to do? So, why am I bringing up deception? Well, you apply deception using what are called tactics and techniques, and yes, those are separate things. Concealment is hiding a data source or on a device or on the network. Disinform, not misinform. What's the difference between disinform and misinformation? Do you understand? You know what the difference is? The difference is intent. Misinformation is accidental. Disinformation is deliberate. We are deliberately disinforming them to provide decoy data and systems during internal reconnaissance. We are misdirecting attack activities to non-production assets, in this case, decoys. And we are disrupting intelligence gathering and lateral movement. The key function of counterintelligence is to disrupt intelligence gathering. What is an attacker doing when he's conducting recon? Gathering intelligence. What is he doing when he's conducting identity-based recon? Gathering identity intelligence. So, the techniques we use to implement these tactics is cloaking. This is when we can actively cloak data at your endpoints in an Active Directory in your identity infrastructure. Decoys, systems that are sacrificial and non-production value. These could be applications, these can be servers, these can be entire networks that are designed to occupy an attacker. You can actually create an entirely fake Active Directory environment as a decoy. Bait and lures. These are decoy credential data assets that you spread all over on your endpoints and your Active Directory. These can even be fake documents and other fake data, fake drives. How about a fake network drive that you can map that is only visible to attackers through a net use command? So, cyber deception implements deceptive tactics through deceptive techniques. So, this is deception's role in identity security. You want to prevent data gathering. You want to provide fake identity data. If I, as an attacker, steal a credential, you don't want that to be a real credential. You want to conceal privileged identity data. If I look for a domain admin list from your domain controller, I shouldn't be able to get it. Misdirect attackers with bait and lures. The credentials they steal will lead them away from your production assets. And you want to use decoy systems as destinations for those bait and lures, because now you can set up that decoy system to be identical to a production system except for the data. And then when the attacker attacks that system, you record everything they do. Now you're gathering intelligence, which is a counterintelligence function. You're gathering intelligence on your adversary on the tools he is using to actively attack you right now. So why use deception if I'm implementing identity threat detection and response? Well, let's walk through a scenario. I'm an attacker and I steal a credential. That gives me unconstrained lateral movement, right? I can move around. I'm impersonating a user. ITDR gives me an alert. That's good. But the data that I steal is still useful to me. I've got your domain admins list. I know your service principal names. I can do ticket injection to conduct a golden ticket attack. I can identify your domain controllers and hundreds of other queries that I can run from command line or PowerShell. I can do a DC sync attack. I can set up my own domain controller and make changes to it and upload it to your domain controller with a DC shadow attack. I can do all of these things because I can get the real information. Deception stops all that. You give the attacker fake credentials, fake domain admins lists, fake service principal names. You give them decoys to access, and none of this happens. Everything that I gather becomes useless to me. That's why we say that deception enhances identity security. How many here are familiar with an attack timeline? Not the kill chain, but an attack timeline. Okay, yeah, Technologist company. It all starts with external reconnaissance and target acquisition. This is something you can't do anything about. Then they have what's called an initial breach. And then after the initial breach, they have an established foothold, conduct internal reconnaissance, steal credentials, escalate privileges, move laterally, and then they keep that persistent cycle going until they find your high-value targets and they execute mission. That cycle can be 328 days with an identity-based attack. So the goal is to shift your detections as far left of that cycle as possible, as close to what we call boom, as close to boom, as close to that initial entry point. Now, you guys have standard prevention mechanisms. That's EPP EDR. That's file-based detection, right? Signature-based. You know how to get around signature-based detection? Change the signature. You change the hash. You use a packer. You zip it. Add it to a password-protected zip file. You repack it 5, 7, 10 times. You rearrange code. You add nonsense code. There's a whole bunch of things you can do to evade code slice detection and hash detection. So that's table stakes. That's initial. Everyone's got some form of EPP or EDR. So you go with behavioral detection, UBA. That's anomalies, fileless exploits. That's LOLBAS, living off the land, binaries and scripts. Have you ever seen a fileless exploit work? Okay. Microsoft Office, when you used to install it, and if you can still install it locally, adds approximately 10 to 15,000 API calls that I can use to build malware without downloading a single binary onto your system. I just have to use a script. And that script can run in the background of a browser as I do what's called a watering hole attack on something like CNN.com. These are meant to evade detection. But if you have proper behavioral detection mechanisms, you can detect them. Anyone know how behavioral detection works, how UEBA works? It's simple and not. So you create a baseline of what's considered appropriate behavior. That baseline you record, and it gets modified as it gets better. So that baseline will adjust the longer you run that baseline recording. But at some point, you have to make it static. Or certain mechanisms will allow you to adjust it on a periodic basis. And then you define what are called acceptable deviations from that baseline. Here's the problem, and this is where UEBA tuning becomes such a bear. If the baseline deviation is too high, it's too wide, you don't detect things that you should be detecting. If it's too narrow, you get too many false positives. But it can work. And right now, there are companies that are using AI to help tune UEBA. And that is pretty effective, but it's not perfect. Okay, you've got two detection mechanisms, and I've told you ways to get around them. So now we're getting farther away from boom, and now your actions are more extreme. Because the later you find an attack, the more damage the attacker can cause. So now you've got IR actions. You do things like rolling back. You're doing things like forensics for root cause analysis. This is all about analytics and response and resolution mechanisms. Do you want to patch? Do you want to roll back? Do you want to re-image? And then you've also have to pull in threat hunting. This is where you've got your XDR responses with your third-party platforms. You're going to ingest telemetry. You're going to do hunting. What other systems are broken? What other systems are compromised? Where else is this attacker? But at that point, you're doing major, major cleanup, right? If you're detecting the attacker this far into the game, you're never getting rid of them. We know of a client that used other security solutions, and their Active Directory was completely compromised. It's a big client, big customer, big entity, I should say. And it's been 2.5 years and they're still cleaning. So, identity threat detection response is the closest you can detect to boom. That is the farthest left. Why do I say that? Because this happens during reconnaissance phase. You can detect the attacker at initial reconnaissance and initial credential theft on that endpoint. That is immediately after initial compromise, but before they've had a chance to spread around and move laterally. Would you rather detect them there or later down the line? This is why we stress identity threat detection response. And then deception runs through the entire attack cycle. You can run deception during the entire attack and the attacker would never know if your deception is that good. So you see, ITDR sits in front of every other detection mechanism and is more effective at it for identity-based attacks than they are. So we talked about identity security goals, so let's circle back. Reduce the attacker to the opportunities to succeed. You do that with identity attack surface reduction. You want to reduce your risks to your identity attack surface. That's removing stored credentials, monitoring and doing audits on your Active Directory, remediating your Active Directory exposures, remediating your Azure Active Directory Enter ID exposures. Find attackers early before they exploit identities. This is ITDR. This is detecting them and using deception to stop them from stealing identities that they can reuse. Disrupt attackers from misusing identities. This is cyber deception to enhance identity security. That's hiding your domain admins list. That's providing decoy domain admins lists that they then try to exploit. And then making identity a pillar of the security strategy. This is where you want to incorporate identity security as part of your full holistic platform. This is where you want to end up. You want identity to be part and parcel of your entire identity security strategy. Your infrastructure should include identity security top to bottom. Are there any questions? Questions? I know I went through a lot. Yes?
Sounds like an opportunity for somebody to sell deception tools.
So yes, it is. I'm not going to talk about products, right? I want this to be about thought leadership. But if you do a search for cyber deception and deception technology a few years ago, there was a company called Ativo Networks. And Ativo Networks was the 800-pound gorilla in the cyber deception. We were, according to every analyst, the best cyber deception technology available. That technology was bought by SentinelOne. And so that's how I became a SentinelOne employee. I came from Ativo Networks. So yes, cyber deception is still part of the game. But the way some companies are deploying it is not as effective as it could be. So yes, there is opportunity there. But yes, deception is a critical component that most people have very clear misunderstandings about. So yes.
Well, cyber deception, like anything, is not without cost. There is cost to it.
Yes.
So how do you convince the C-suite to spend money on something that's basically all fake instead of putting it more into R&D and everything else?
So security is always a cost center. It's never a revenue generator. So you have to couch it in these terms. If an attacker were to break in right now, how much business impact will that cause us? How much money will it cost us? How much reputational cost will that entail? Deception, besides identity security, has a whole other gamut of capabilities that I haven't even talked about. The whole point of cyber deception is that it should be part of your regular network, but invisible to your regular users. And only attackers would actually interact with it. The key component of using decoys as detection mechanisms is that they're non-production assets and no one should be touching them. Any touch is an indicator of potentially malicious activity. That's why if an attacker steals a fake credential, you know that's malicious. If an attacker runs, and no attacker really does this anymore, we don't run Nmap scans, they're too noisy. Unless you use like timing 1, and it takes months to run a single network scan, which no one really waits for. And why bother? Because you can run ransomware attack and make so much more money so much quicker. If an attacker runs a ping sweep or a port scan, they're going to touch decoys, and those decoys are going to send alarm bells, and you know an attacker is running recon. The point of a deception is that it's going to give you early detection. Would you rather have early detection? Remember that attack cycle that I just talked about? Would you rather have early detection and a low cost to clean up, or wait until your attacker has a chance to spread like cancer and then spend millions of dollars in cyber chemotherapy trying to get them out? That's how you sell deception. Any other questions? So who here thinks that they have identity security still? All right. Well, that's all I had for today. Please visit us at booth 401. That QR code points to sentinel1.com if you want any more information on this or any other topic that I've touched upon. If you have any other questions, please visit us at booth 401. And otherwise, thank you for your time.